In the scorching heat of a Mexican summer, the year 2015 was unfolding like any other in the notorious maximum security prison of Altiplano. The facility, designed to hold the country's most hardened criminals, was a labyrinth of concrete and steel, nestled in the heart of the Mexican state of Mexico. As the sun began to set on July 11, casting a golden glow over the prison's imposing structure, a sense of unease settled over the inmates and guards alike. It was as if the very air was thick with anticipation, heavy with the weight of secrets and lies. In a cell deep within the prison's bowels, a man named Joaquin Guzman, more commonly known as El Chapo, sat calmly on his bunk, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the cold, gray walls that surrounded him. His was a face that had become synonymous with the notorious Sinaloa cartel, an organization that had wreaked havoc on the streets of Mexico and beyond. With a reputation for cunning and ruthlessness, El Chapo had managed to evade capture for over a decade, earning him a mythical status among his peers and a permanent place on the most wanted lists of law enforcement agencies around the world. But on this particular evening, as the sounds of the prison's daily routine began to wind down, El Chapo's thoughts were consumed by a different kind of calculation. His mind was racing with the possibilities, weighing the risks and benefits of a plan that had been months in the making. It was a plan that would require precision, patience, and a deep understanding of the prison's inner workings. As he sat in the darkness, his eyes never leaving the point on the wall that seemed to hold his attention, a small, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips. It was a smile that spoke of confidence, of a man who knew that he was on the cusp of something big. Outside the prison walls, the town of Almoloya de Juarez was bathed in a warm, golden light. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional passing car or the distant sound of children's laughter. It was a peaceful scene, one that belied the turmoil that was brewing just a few kilometers away. In a small, unassuming house on the outskirts of town, a group of men had gathered, their faces illuminated only by the faint glow of a single, flickering light bulb. They were men with a mission, men who had been tasked with the impossible, to break El Chapo out of the most secure prison in Mexico. As the night wore on, the tension in the house grew. The men spoke in hushed tones, their voices barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. They were a mix of old and young, seasoned veterans of the cartel and fresh-faced recruits, all united by a single goal: to free their leader and restore the Sinaloa cartel to its former glory. But as they pored over the plans, studying the blueprints of the prison and the escape route, a sense of doubt began to creep in. It was a plan that had been months in the making, but it was also a plan that relied on a number of variables that could easily go wrong. In the prison, El Chapo's smile had grown wider, his confidence soaring with each passing minute. He knew that the plan was in motion, that the wheels were turning, and that soon he would be free. But as he sat in the darkness, his ears straining to pick up any sound that might indicate the start of the escape, a sudden noise broke the silence. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from the corridor outside his cell. El Chapo's heart skipped a beat as he froze, his eyes locked on the door, waiting to see what would happen next. The footsteps stopped outside his cell, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then, the sound of keys jingling, followed by the creaking of the door as it swung open. A figure stood in the doorway, a guard who looked at El Chapo with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "What's going on?" El Chapo asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but the guard just shook his head and said, "You're being moved to a different cell. The warden wants to see you." El Chapo's mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening. Was this part of the plan, or had something gone wrong? He stood up, his eyes never leaving the guard, and began to walk towards the door. As he stepped out into the corridor, he caught a glimpse of something that made his heart skip a beat. A small, almost imperceptible signal, a signal that told him the plan was still on, and that freedom was within his grasp. The guard led El Chapo through the winding corridors of the prison, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. They passed by cell after cell, each one filled with the sounds of inmates talking, laughing, and crying. The prison was a labyrinth, a maze of concrete and steel, and El Chapo knew it like the back of his hand. He had been planning this escape for months, studying the layout of the prison, looking for weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And now, as he walked through the corridors, he could feel the tension building, the sense of anticipation growing. As they turned a corner, El Chapo caught a glimpse of a ventilation shaft in the wall. It was a small opening, just big enough for a man to squeeze through. He felt a surge of excitement, knowing that this was the route they would take. The guard seemed oblivious to the significance of the shaft, but El Chapo knew that it was the key to their escape. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest, as he followed the guard towards the warden's office. The warden's office was a small, cramped room filled with the smell of smoke and sweat. The warden himself was a large, imposing man, with a thick beard and a scowl that could curdle milk. He looked at El Chapo with a mixture of disdain and curiosity, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. "So, you're the famous El Chapo," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I've heard a lot about you." El Chapo smiled, his eyes glinting with amusement. "And I've heard a lot about you, Warden," he replied, his voice smooth as silk. "You have a reputation for being one of the toughest wardens in the country." The warden snorted, his face reddening with anger. "I'll have you know, I'm the best warden this prison has ever seen," he said, his voice rising. "And I'll make sure you rot in here for the rest of your life." El Chapo laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "We'll see about that, Warden," he said, his eyes glinting with defiance. The warden's face turned red with rage, and for a moment, El Chapo thought he was going to attack him. But then, the warden seemed to regain control of himself, and he spoke in a calm, measured tone. "I've been told to move you to a different cell," he said. "One with extra security measures." El Chapo's heart sank, his mind racing with the implications. Was this the end of the plan, or was it just a setback? He looked at the warden, trying to read his expression, but the man's face was a mask of stone. El Chapo knew that he had to think fast, to come up with a new plan, or risk being trapped in the prison forever. As he stood there, his mind racing with possibilities, he felt a sense of determination growing inside him. He would escape, no matter what it took. And as he followed the guard out of the warden's office, he caught a glimpse of the ventilation shaft, and he knew that freedom was within his grasp. The guard led El Chapo back to his cell, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls once again. El Chapo's mind was racing with thoughts of the new cell, the extra security measures that would be in place. He knew that this was a setback, but he was determined to escape. As they walked, he caught glimpses of the other inmates, their faces a blur as he passed by. He was focused on the task at hand, his mind working overtime to come up with a new plan. As they approached his cell, El Chapo saw one of his associates, a man named Carlos, standing by the door. Carlos was a tall, lanky man with a scar above his left eyebrow. He was one of the few people in the prison that El Chapo trusted, and he knew that Carlos would be instrumental in helping him escape. El Chapo nodded to Carlos as he passed, a small signal that told him to be ready. The guard opened the cell door and motioned for El Chapo to enter. El Chapo stepped inside, his eyes scanning the small space. The cell was sparse, with a single bed and a small table in the corner. El Chapo sat down on the bed, his mind racing with thoughts of the new cell. He knew that he had to act fast, to come up with a new plan before he was moved. As he sat there, he heard the sound of footsteps outside the cell. The guard was returning, this time with a group of inmates who were tasked with moving El Chapo's belongings to the new cell. El Chapo watched as they worked, his eyes scanning the group for any sign of weakness. He knew that he had to be careful, that one misstep could mean disaster. As the inmates worked, El Chapo caught sight of a small, almost imperceptible signal from Carlos. It was a slight nod, a small gesture that told El Chapo that everything was in place. El Chapo's heart skipped a beat as he realized that the plan was still on, that freedom was still within his grasp. The inmates finished moving El Chapo's belongings, and the guard motioned for him to stand up. El Chapo complied, his eyes locked on the guard as he followed him out of the cell. As they walked, El Chapo could feel the tension building, the sense of anticipation growing. He knew that this was it, that this was his chance to escape. The guard led El Chapo to the new cell, a small, secure room deep in the heart of the prison. El Chapo's eyes scanned the space, taking in the extra security measures that had been put in place. There were cameras in the corners, motion detectors on the walls, and a thick, steel door that looked almost impenetrable. El Chapo's heart sank as he realized the magnitude of the task ahead of him. But he was not one to give up easily. He began to pace back and forth in the cell, his mind racing with thoughts of escape. He knew that he had to find a weakness, a flaw in the system that he could exploit. As he paced, he noticed a small, almost imperceptible gap between the wall and the floor. It was a tiny space, one that looked almost impossible to squeeze through. But El Chapo's eyes lit up with excitement as he realized that this might be his only chance. He began to work on the gap, using his hands to dig and scrape at the concrete. The work was slow and laborious, but El Chapo was determined. He knew that this was his only chance, that he had to escape before it was too late. As he worked, he could feel the tension building, the sense of anticipation growing. He knew that he was getting close, that freedom was within his grasp. The hours passed slowly, the sound of El Chapo's digging echoing off the walls. The guard checked on him periodically, but El Chapo was careful to cover his tracks. He knew that he had to be patient, that he had to wait for the perfect moment to make his move. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the prison, El Chapo's excitement grew. He knew that this was it, that this was his chance to escape. The guard made one final check on El Chapo, his eyes scanning the cell for any sign of disturbance. But El Chapo was ready, his body tense and alert. He knew that this was the moment, that he had to act fast. The guard turned to leave, and El Chapo made his move. He squeezed through the gap, his body compressing as he pushed through the narrow space. He felt a rush of excitement as he emerged on the other side, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. He was in a narrow, dimly lit tunnel, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. El Chapo's heart was pounding in his chest, his senses on high alert. He knew that he had to move fast, to put as much distance between himself and the prison as possible. He began to run, his feet pounding against the concrete floor. The tunnel stretched out before him, a long, winding path that seemed to disappear into the darkness. El Chapo's excitement grew as he ran, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he was getting close, that freedom was within his grasp. The tunnel began to slope downward, the air growing colder and damper. El Chapo's breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning with exertion. He could feel the weight of the prison above him, the crushing pressure of the concrete and steel. But he was determined to escape, to make it out alive. He pushed on, his feet pounding against the floor, his heart racing with excitement. As he ran, the tunnel began to narrow, the walls closing in on him. El Chapo's senses were on high alert, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. He knew that he was getting close, that he was almost there. The tunnel began to slope upward, the air growing warmer and fresher. El Chapo's heart was pounding in his chest, his excitement growing. He knew that he was almost free, that he was almost out of the prison. And then, just as he was starting to think that he had made it, El Chapo heard the sound of footsteps behind him. The guard had discovered his escape, and he was hot on El Chapo's heels. El Chapo's heart sank, his mind racing with thoughts of capture and imprisonment. He knew that he had to move fast, to put as much distance between himself and the guard as possible. He began to run, his feet pounding against the floor, his heart racing with excitement. The tunnel stretched out before him, a long, winding path that seemed to disappear into the darkness. El Chapo's excitement grew as he ran, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he was getting close, that freedom was within his grasp. The guard was closing in, his footsteps getting louder and closer. El Chapo could feel the weight of the prison behind him, the crushing pressure of the concrete and steel. He knew that he had to keep moving, to keep running if he wanted to escape. He pushed on, his feet pounding against the floor, his heart racing with excitement. The tunnel began to narrow, the walls closing in on him. El Chapo's senses were on high alert, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. He knew that he was getting close, that he was almost there. And then, just as he was starting to think that he had made it, El Chapo saw a glimmer of light in the distance. It was a small opening, a tiny gap in the wall that seemed to lead outside. El Chapo's heart skipped a beat as he realized that this was it, that this was his chance to escape. He began to run, his feet pounding against the floor, his heart racing with excitement. The opening grew larger, the light growing brighter. El Chapo's excitement grew, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he was almost free, that he was almost out of the prison. The guard was right behind him, his footsteps getting louder and closer. El Chapo could feel the weight of the prison behind him, the crushing pressure of the concrete and steel. He knew that he had to keep moving, to keep running if he wanted to escape. He pushed on, his feet pounding against the floor, his heart racing with excitement. The opening grew larger, the light growing brighter. El Chapo's excitement grew, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he was almost free, that he was almost out of the prison. And then, just as he was about to emerge into the light, everything went black. The sudden darkness was not the embrace of unconsciousness, but the abrupt cessation of the tunnel itself. One moment, his pounding feet were carrying him forward, the next, the ground vanished beneath him. He plunged into a void, a sickening lurch in his stomach as gravity seized him. Air rushed past his ears, a brief, terrifying freefall before he landed hard, jarring his entire frame. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, and for a moment, he lay gasping, disoriented, the metallic tang of fear sharp on his tongue. He expected concrete, or rock, but his body had met something softer, a mound of loose soil and debris that broke his fall. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest, every joint aching. The darkness here.